Okay, so what we're looking at here is the first segment of new learning from day 3 of the Skillful Teacher. And basically, at the beginning of this section, we reference the fact that for today's content, what we're actually doing is making a connection back to some of the learning that we did on day 2 around building growth mindsets. And before we started this connection, there were 2 things that I asked of the teachers in attendance to think about as we worked through this session. The first thing I wanted them to remember is simply the idea that growth mindsets aren't built over the course of a day or a lesson. And instead, what we know about a growth mindset is that it takes slow and continual work over lots of time to build a growth mindset. And that's why we use the metaphor of a stalactite or a stalagmite in day 2 to represent how growth mindsets are built. So that was the one idea I wanted teachers to keep in mind. And then the second was, I wanted them to remember just the simple concept that past performance, when it comes to students, their past performance in no way should be predictive of future outcomes. In other words, we want to keep in mind the fact that just because a student wasn't able to perform well on something or had low scores in the past doesn't mean that they're limited in any way. They still have the ability to learn and demonstrate their learning at high levels. So what we did then was took some time and talk a little bit about some common practices that teachers engage in over the first few weeks of school as they attempt to get to know their students. And I'll go ahead and click through the slide as I talk about this. But basically, we asked the teachers in attendance to raise their hand if they found that they did any of these things over the first few weeks of school. And that included looking up students' test scores, talking to their colleagues about students that they currently have that maybe their colleagues had in past years, giving students some form of pre-assessment or benchmark assessment at the beginning of the year, or maybe talking with a special ed case manager or a site EL coordinator about particular students that had been in a class. And what I asked teachers to do then, after they identified whether they'd done those things or not, is I asked them to then take some time and turn to a partner and talk about the benefits of collecting this sort of data, why it was that they were doing these things. And teachers came up with a lot of good ideas. But then what I asked them to do as well is take a little bit of time and talk to that same partner again about whether there are any potential risks or dangers associated with this kind of data collection. And in particular, I asked teachers to think back to the Pygmalion study that showed that when teachers were told that their students are going to perform at low levels, that in fact what ends up happening over the course of the year is that the teacher doesn't expect much of the students, and the students do end up performing at low levels, whether the students have higher abilities or not. And so teachers then took some time and talked about this, and I think what we came to the conclusion, what the conclusion we came to at the end of this discussion wasn't so much that we don't want to collect pre-assessment data or information about our students' needs early in the year, but simply that we want to be really careful and cautious that it doesn't prejudice us in any sort of way. And at this moment, I asked or let teachers know that there's a Google folder that the Skillful Teacher, the mentor team, has going. And in that Google folder, there's an article called Just How Easy is High Expectations for All. And it's written by a teacher and talking about kind of the struggle he has in collecting information about his students and not letting it prejudice him in any sort of way. And here's just a quote from the article where he talks about the fact that so many times in the first few weeks of school we get information or data about our students' performances. And sometimes it's not necessarily even a test score, just the way a student looks, or perhaps a first assignment that a student turns in that isn't necessarily indicative of how well he or she could do. And the important thing that he reminds us of is simply that it's okay to collect this sort of data, but we want to keep in mind that past performance is not predictive of future outcomes, and in no way do we want to let this sort of information prejudice us when it comes to our expectations about how our students can perform in our classes. What we did then is we took a little bit of time and kind of talked for a minute about something that was seemingly unrelated at first, but then we tied this concept back into thinking about growth mindsets. And what I did was introduce to the group a book that the mentor team read last year called Practice Perfect by Doug Lemov. And he's the same guy that wrote Teach Like a Champion. And one of the things that Doug Lemov talks about in this book is The fact that after he wrote Teach Like a Champion, one thing that he and his team did was they went out and did a lot of professional development seminars at different schools where they trained groups of teachers in the different techniques that he talks about in his book. And at the end of those trainings, he would always be careful to ask the teachers at the training for feedback. And invariably, the feedback came back that, oh, it's great ideas. They really look forward to trying them out in their classrooms. They thought that everything was really well done. But then at some point, Lemov and his team decided that it probably wasn't enough just to collect feedback in the moment, but what they wanted to do was actually check in with those same teachers a couple of months later to see how successful they were in implementing those techniques in their own classrooms. And what they found at first was really troubling. What they found was that the teachers reported back to them that they actually really struggled to implement the techniques and that they had very few successes in terms of being able to integrate them into their practice. And Lemov and his team was really troubled by that, so they spent some time thinking about it. Why might that be? And what they realized ultimately was that teaching, in many ways, is a performance sport. And what I mean by that is it shares a lot of qualities in common with other performance, sports or activities. And here's a quote kind of from the book that demonstrates what they learned. But basically, it was the idea that they know that, or what we know about athletes, for example, is that if they're trying to learn something new, they don't just talk about that new idea and then implement it in the middle of a game. What they do is they first talk and learn about the idea, and then they practice it a bunch before they ever get around to trying it in a game or a match. And that's what leads them to be successful. And so Lemov and his group had an epiphany. And that was that in their professional development seminars, it wasn't enough to talk about good ideas or best practice, but instead what they needed to do is get their teachers that were attending their PD seminars to actually get up and practice the skills they wanted them to be able to implement as well. And so that kind of pulls us back to the discussion we had earlier on around building growth mindsets in students. And this is the point at which we told teachers that we were going to be doing a little bit of role-playing today. And we knew that role-playing is uncomfortable for some people, but the reason why we're doing it is because it provides us with an opportunity to practice that makes us much more likely to be able to actually execute the skills when it comes time. And basically what we role-played in this moment was a situation in which there was a teacher that, while with good intentions, was actually starting to talk about getting some pre-assessment or early information or data about students in his or her class that was leading them to think about that student's ability to perform in a very fixed way, that the student would be limited. And here's an example. This is the example that Terry and I modeled for the group. But basically you can see in this scenario, what's happened is I've gotten a couple students in my class. I've identified the fact that they're EL students, and I've come to the conclusion, even though I likely know the truth about intelligence, that there's no way that these students are going to be able to perform well in my class. And basically in this role play, it was then Terry's job to take the role of a change agent and to try to remind me about what I know about growth mindsets and how all students have the ability to learn at high levels, and that past performance in no way should be predictive of future outcomes. And basically over the course of a 2 to 3 minute conversation, Terry very carefully was able to get me to fix my thinking and remember that these students would have the ability to be successful in my class. And it was at this moment that I then took a quick time out and told the teachers in attendance that the idea of this exercise wasn't that we wanted them suddenly to become the growth mindset police, and that we wanted them to run around campus and with an ear out listening to hear if they had any colleagues that were talking about students in their class with a fixed mindset. We know that it can be challenging to try to talk to our colleagues about things that they may say, and so we didn't want to put teachers in a spot where they felt like they had to necessarily intervene when it came to other people, but really what we wanted to do through this role play was remind people of the fact that oftentimes this dialogue plays out in our own heads, and what we want to do is simply be aware of the fact that sometimes we might think about students in these particular ways and really try to catch ourselves in that thinking and remind ourselves about the truth of about intelligence and ability. And so you can see from here, we then took some time and asked the teachers to debrief the sample role play that Terry and I did before teachers then had the opportunity to get together with a partner or a triad and again, try the role play out and see whether they could get the teachers that were talking in the beginning to recognize the fact that they were thinking about their students and their ability through a fixed lens and change that to more of a growth lens.